There are people we decide about before we ever meet them. We hear a name, we hear a rumor, and somewhere behind our eyes a little courtroom convenes, hands down its verdict and locks the door. We tell ourselves we are being careful. We are usually just being afraid. I'm going to tell you about a man I judged for 2 years before I learned the shape of his face. I'm going to tell you about a hole in a cliff that the whole valley called a prison, and about the night the sky came apart and showed us what it really was. I'm not telling you this because I came out of it a better man. I'm telling you because I came out of it alive, owing my life to the one person I decided wasn't worth knowing, and because some debts don't let you sleep until you've said them out loud. Stay with me. The first part is the part where I was wrong about almost everything. The hard part comes later. The first hailstone hit me on the bridge of the nose, and the second one hit the gelding hard enough that he screamed and tried to climb the sky. I want you to understand how fast it came on, because I've told this story to men who weren't there and they always say the same thing: you should have known, you should have turned back. As if weather in that country ever sent a letter ahead. One minute I was riding the wash with my collar up against a dry wind, counting fence posts out of habit the way other men hum. 41, 42. The next minute the light went the color of an old bruise. The air smelled like wet iron, and the whole western rim of the canyon disappeared behind a gray curtain that was coming for me at the speed of a running horse. I'd lost a steer that morning. That's the only reason I was up in Coyoacán Wash at all, a place decent men in our valley did not go, a place I had spent 2 years agreeing not to go. The animal had drifted off through a gap in the brush during the gather, and like a fool I'd followed his tracks higher and higher into the broken country, past the last of my own range, telling myself one more bend, one more bend. My name is Eli Hartman, and in those days I had a habit of following lost things farther than was wise. I'd lost a wife to the fever 3 winters back and a boy the same week, and I think some part of me had never stopped riding after them, into worse and worse ground, one more bend. So the hail, the gelding bolting, me hauling on the reins with both fists while the ice came down in stones the size of robin's eggs, drumming the canyon floor white, and the gelding not caring one whit about my opinion on the matter. He ran. I let him because the alternative was getting thrown onto a field of bouncing rock, and we tore up the wash with the storm chewing at our heels, and I remember thinking, with the strange flat clarity that comes when you've stopped being in charge of your own life, this is how it happens. This is the day. Then the gelding put a hoof in a badger hole. I went over his neck. The world turned a slow, stupid cartwheel, and I had time to notice the underside of a juniper, very green and very close, before the ground arrived and took the wind clean out of me. I lay there with the hail flailing my back, my left arm wrong somehow, and I could not make my lungs work. The gelding was up and gone, a brown smear vanishing into the gray, and I was alone in a place I had no business being, in a storm that was going to kill me one cold stone at a time. I want to tell you I prayed. I didn't, I cursed. I cursed the steer and the badger and the sky and my own restless feet, and I crawled, that's the honest word, crawled toward the only dark thing I could see, a black slot in the base of the cliff maybe 40 yards off. I didn't know what it was. I didn't care. A coyote den would have done. I went on my belly and one good elbow across the hailstones, and they cracked against my skull and my spine like 1,000 small fists, and the slot in the rock got bigger and blacker, and then a hand came out of it. A brown hand, broad, scarred across the knuckles. It closed around my collar and it pulled, and I came up off the ground and through a curtain of hanging hide and into a sudden, ringing, impossible quiet. I have to back up now, because you can't understand what that hand meant to me unless you understand what I'd been told about the hand's owner. Everyone in our valley knew about the man in the cliff. Nobody had spoken to him. That's the thing about a place like ours, the less anyone actually knew, the more certain they got. The story, as it had been handed to me my first week in the country by a freighter named Del Cobb over a glass of sour beer, went like this. There was an Apache living up in Coyoacán Wash, in a cave in the rock, all alone, and he'd been there for years. And he never came down except at night. And you'd best not go up there because he was either crazy or a murderer or both, and the army had put him there, or he'd escaped from the army. The story changed depending on how many beers Dell had in him. A prison, Dell called it. They walled him up in that hole like a snake in a jar. He said it with relish, the way some men say terrible things, enjoying the shiver. Best place for him, best place for all of them. I was new and tired and grieving, and I did what new, tired, grieving men do. I took the easy story. It cost me nothing to believe it. I never rode up the wash. I told the children at the schoolhouse. I drove a wagon of Valley kids twice a week. It was a way to be useful. I told them the same thing every grown body told them. Stay out of Coyoacán, there's a wild man up there. And I tallied my fence posts and my cattle and my losses in a little leather book I kept in my breast pocket, because counting was the one thing that still made the world feel like it had edges, and I did not think about the man in the cliff any more than I thought about the weather. He was just a fact of the country, a danger you steered around. 2 years. 2 years I'd lived 11 miles from a man, and known nothing about him but a freighter's ghost story. And now his hand was on my collar, and his cave had just swallowed the storm whole. Inside, the world was the color of banked coals. There was a fire, small, careful, set back against the rear wall where the smoke could find a crack and ribbon upward out of sight. The light of it moved on the stone, and the stone was not the rough black hole I'd imagined from outside. It had been lived in, worked. The floor was swept. There were ledges cut or found in the rock, and on them sat things in tidy rows, gourds, a coil of rope, bundles of dried herbs hanging from a peg of bone, the long bones of some animal cleaned and arranged by size. A back chamber went deeper than the firelight could reach. Somewhere in that dark I could hear water, a slow, patient tick of it dropping into a pool. And there was the man. He had let go of my collar and stepped back, and now he stood between me and the fire, looking down at me where I'd sprawled, and I got my first real look at the monster of Coyoacán Wash. He was old, not been told but seasoned, the way a fence post goes gray and hard and outlasts the man who set it. His hair was iron and pulled back from a face that was all flat planes and deep lines, and there was a scar that ran from under his left eye down into his jaw, old and white. He wore a calico shirt gone the color of dust and a pair of cavalry trousers with the stripe worn off, and he was barefoot, and his feet on the cold stone did not seem to mind it. He held no weapon. He just looked at me, and his eyes I'd been braced for crazy, for the rolling wild eyes Dell had promised. His eyes were the steadiest thing in that whole shaking world, dark and quiet and reading me, head to foot, the way I'd read a sky. "Your arm," he said. That was the first thing the wild man of the wash ever said to me. Not a war cry, not a threat. He spoke English with a careful, deliberate accent, fitting each word in place like a man laying stone, and he was looking at my left arm, which I was holding against my chest like something I'd stolen. I came off my horse," I said. My voice came out cracked. "I think it's broke." He crouched. He moved the way water moves, no waste in it, and before I could so much as flinch he had taken my wrist in one hand and my elbow in the other, and his thumbs found their way along the bone, pressing, and I gasped, and he said, "No, not broke here." His thumb settled on a spot above the elbow that lit up like a struck match. "Out of the house. The bone come out of its house." He looked at me, and there was a question in it, asking my permission, which is a thing I did not expect and have never forgotten. I nodded because I couldn't talk. He set my shoulder back into its socket with one short, brutal, merciful motion, and I made a sound I am not proud of. And then the white fire went out of the joint, and there was only a deep, ordinary ache, and I sat there breathing, and the man went back to his side of the fire and let me be. Outside, the hail had turned to rain, a roar of it, the whole sky emptying. The hide curtain over the mouth of the cave shuddered and pressed inward with the wind and held. Water sheeted down the cliff face past the opening, a moving wall of silver in the last of the light. And I understood, sitting there cradling my arm, that if that hand had not come out of the rock, I would be lying out in the wash right now, broken, while the wash filled up with brown water and carried me down to the valley as one more lost thing. I'd come up here believing this was a prison, a hole a man had been thrown into and forgotten. It had just saved my life. We didn't speak for a long while. He fed the fire. I watched him do it and tried to make my fear behave, because the fear was still there, 2 years of it, sitting in my chest like a second man. Everything I'd been told said I should be afraid. Everything I could see said the telling had been a lie. The two facts ground against each other and gave off a kind of heat, and I think that grinding is the most honest thing I can tell you about that first hour. I did not have a change of heart, clean and sudden, the way it happens in stories. I sat in a stranger's home, in the warm, dry dark he had made, drinking the water he handed me in a gourd, and I went on being afraid of him the whole time. Being grateful and being afraid at once. That's a real thing a man can be. I've been it since in other rooms. After a time he said, without looking at me, "Your animal will go home. Horses are not fools." A pause. "Men come up the wash for steers and for hate. You come for a steer." It wasn't quite a question. It was him sorting me, filing me. "I lost one in the gather," I said. "Followed him too far." He turned a stick of mesquite in the coals. "I have seen you, the wagon, the children." That hit me strangely. You watch the road." "I watch everything," he said, and there was the faintest dry turn at the corner of his mouth, gone before I could be sure of it. "It is the only door I have, the watching." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said the foolish thing, the thing that had sat in me for 2 years and now came up unbidden in the firelight, because fear makes a man blurt. "They say the army put you here, that this place is that you can't leave." His hand went still on the stick, the fire popped. Somewhere back in the dark the water went tick. "They say many things," he said at last, very quietly. "Some of them I made true with my own hands, long ago, in another life, in a war your people do not call a war." He looked up at me then, and the firelight was in the lines of his face, and I saw something there I had not let myself imagine when I'd called him the wild man to a wagon load of children. I saw grief. Old grief, settled and carried, the kind I'd been hauling around myself for 3 years and recognized the instant I saw it on another face. But no man put me in this rock, Hartman. I startled at my own name. I hadn't given it to him. "I told you," he said, "I watch everything." And there it was again, that ghost of dry humor, a man who had been alone so long that even his jokes had gone solitary. "You are the one whose woman and whose boy are under the 2 stones by the cottonwood on the bench above your house. I have seen you go up there. You go on Sundays. You take off your hat and you do not put it back on for a long time." I could not breathe right. To be seen like that, to have been watched in my rawest, most private hour by the man I'd taught children to fear, it should have felt like a violation. It didn't. It felt, God help me, like being known. Like somebody in that empty country had been keeping a ledger of my grief the same way I kept one of my cattle, just so that it would be counted, just so it would be real. "Yeah," I said, my voice had gone to gravel. "My wife and my son, the fever." He nodded slowly, as if I'd confirmed a figure in a sum he'd been working. "Then you know," he said, "that a man can be in a place that everyone calls free and be locked up tighter than any rock." He set the stick down. "This cave is not my prison. I am not in it because I cannot leave." He spread his scarred hands, taking in the swept floor, the tidy ledges, the fire, the curtain of rain. "I am in it because everyone I would leave it for is gone. Do you understand the difference? It is everything. It is the whole world, that difference." And I did understand. That was the terrible hinging moment of the whole thing, the moment the door in the little courtroom behind my eyes came open and a cold wind blew through it. I understood him completely, because I was exactly the same kind of locked-up man, 11 miles down the wash in a house everyone called a home, sleeping every night beside a cold place in the bed. We were 2 men in 2 caves. Mine just had a roof I'd paid for and a town that smiled at me. I had taught children to be afraid of my own reflection. The rain went on into the night. He gave me a strip of dried meat and a corn cake gone hard at the edges and said nothing while I ate, which was a kindness, because I don't think I could have talked. When my arm let me, I lay back against the warm rock and the exhaustion came down on me like the storm had, all at once, and I slept the way I hadn't slept since the cottonwood bench got its second stone. I woke once in the deep of the night. The fire was down to a red eye. The rain had softened to a steady hush, and the man was sitting at the mouth of the cave with the hide curtain drawn back, looking out at the dark and the falling water perfectly still, a black shape against a blacker sky, keeping watch, the only door he had. I lay there and looked at the back of that iron-gray head, and I thought about the freighter Del Cobb and the word prison, and how cheaply we'd all agreed to it, the whole valley, year after year, never once climbing the wash to see for ourselves. I thought about how a story is the easiest wall in the world to build and the hardest to tear down, because you don't even have to lift a stone, you just have to repeat yourself, and let other frightened men repeat you, until the man inside the story is walled up so complete that he might as well be in a hole in a cliff. We had built his prison, not the army, us, out of words from 11 miles away in a sour beer saloon. And here he sat, in the home he'd made out of the rock we'd thrown him into, keeping the rain off a man whose children had been taught to fear him. I didn't know yet that the real storm was still 3 weeks off. I didn't know that the gray water already rising in the valley below us was nothing, a rehearsal, a clearing of the sky's throat, and that when the true thing came down out of the mountains, it would put the whole town's lives in his scarred hands and force a decision on him that I would not have had the strength to make. I didn't know any of that yet. I only knew, lying in the red dark with my arm aching and my certainties in ruins, that come morning I was going to have to ride back down the wash and look the valley in the eye and start, somehow, telling a different story. I just didn't have the first idea how much it was going to cost me to tell I. The gelding had come home. He was standing at the corral gate with mud to the hocks and a cut over one eye when I limped down out of the wash the next morning, and he looked at me with the particular contempt horses save for the men who get them into trouble, and I have never in my life been so glad to be looked at with contempt. I want to be honest about the next part, because it's where I'd like to tell you I changed all at once and didn't. I went home. I splinted my own arm with a barrel stave and a strip of saddle blanket because the nearest doctor was a day off and I'd had worse, and I sat in my empty kitchen for a long time turning the night over. I'd ridden down the wash that morning swearing to myself I'd set the valley straight. By the time I had coffee in me, the swearing had gone soft at the edges. Because here is the thing nobody warns you about doing right. It's lonely, and it makes you ridiculous, and a man who has already lost a wife and a boy is not eager to also lose the good opinion of the only people who still nod to him on the road. So I didn't ride into town and stand on a chair and announce that the wild man of Coyoacán had set my shoulder and saved my life. I told myself I'd find the moment. I told myself I'd let it come up natural. What I actually did for the better part of a week was nothing, which is a decision too, the most popular one there is. I just stopped saying the bad thing. When the school kids in my wagon got to whispering about the cave, the way they always did, working themselves up to a delicious shiver, I didn't join in and I didn't feed it. But I didn't stop it either. A girl named Posey Cobb, the freighter's daughter, 8 years old and afraid of her own shadow, asked me straight out, "Mr. Hartman, does the wild man eat people?" And I had every word I needed sitting right there in my mouth, and what I said was, "Eyes front, Posey, mind the road." Coward's answer. I knew it while I said it. It took me 11 days to go back up the wash. I counted them. I always count. I went back because of the corn, if you want the small, foolish truth of it. He'd given me that hard corn cake the night of the storm, and somewhere in those 11 days, the fact had started nagging at me that a man living alone in a hole in the rock had corn, had grown something in that broken country, and I couldn't make it fit. A prisoner doesn't plant. A ghost doesn't farm. I told myself I was going up to return the favor with a sack of my own flour and a side of bacon, neighborly, the way you'd treat any man who'd done you a turn. That was the story I rode up with. It was even partly true. I found him on his knees at the bottom of the wash, a quarter-mile below the cave, in a place where the canyon widened and a seep kept the ground damp the year round. And there it was, a garden, not much of one to a valley man's eye. 3 little terraces he'd built up with hauled stone, each one no bigger than a bedsheet, and in them corn knee-high, and beans climbing the corn and squash sprawling underneath, the 3 of them growing up through each other the way I'd later learn his people had always grown them, each one shading the roots of the next, holding the water in. He was building the stone walls higher. He had a basket of river rock beside him, and he was fitting them one at a time, turning each stone in his scarred hands to find how it wanted to sit, the way I'd seen him turn the mesquite stick in the fire. No mortar, just the patience to find where each rock belonged. He didn't look up. "You brought your fear back with you," he said. "I can hear it in how the horse walks." "I brought you bacon," I said. That made him stop. He sat back on his heels and looked at the sack across my saddle, and something moved across his face that I can only call surprise, and under the surprise, very quick, something that hurt to see, a kind of hunger that had nothing to do with food. The hunger of a man who has not been given anything by another human being in longer than he could easily count. He covered it fast. But I'd seen it, and I climbed down off the gelding feeling like the worst kind of fool, because I'd spent 11 days deciding whether this man was worth a sack of flour, and here he was unable to remember the last time anyone had thought he was. He didn't thank me, not in words. He stood and he wiped his hands on his thighs and he said, "You can carry stone or you can stand and be afraid. The afraid does not help the corn." And he turned back to his wall. So I carried stone, with one good arm and one in a sling, up out of the riverbed and over to the terraces, while a man the whole valley called a murderer built a wall to keep his beans alive. We worked the rest of the morning and barely spoke, and it was the first peace I'd felt in 3 years that didn't come out of a bottle or off the back of a hard ride. There is a particular quiet that comes from working beside someone at something that is plainly, simply good, feeding a thing, keeping a thing alive, and I had forgotten it existed. When the sun stood straight up, he stopped and shared out water and a handful of last year's dried squash, and we sat in the shade of the cliff, and that was when I asked him his name. I'd been afraid to. It seemed like too large a thing to ask. He was quiet so long I thought I'd offended him. Then he said a word in his own tongue, soft and quick, that I could not have hoped to repeat. He saw me fail at it and the dry corner of his mouth came up. "Your people could not hold it either," he said. "The soldiers called me by a name they could say. I will not give you that one. It was theirs, not mine." He looked out at the green of the corn. "My mother's people called me a word that means the closest in your tongue, he who stays. When the others went or were taken or died." A pause, and the grief moved under it like a fish under ice. "I stayed. I am still staying. It is the only thing I was ever good at. He who stays. I never did get the word itself. In my own head, in my own ledger, I came to think of him by that, the stayer. The man who, when everything left, did not." Over the next 2 weeks I went up 4 more times. I stopped pretending it was about returning favors. I learned the shape of him the way you learn weather, not from what he said, which was little, but from what he did, which was everything. I'll give you the things I saw, because he'd not want me to make speeches about him, and the things he did say more than any speech could. I saw him spend the better part of a day building a low ramp of brush and earth up the side of his stock tank, a little catchpool he dug to hold the seep water, and when I asked why, he showed me the print in the mud at the bottom where a young javelina had fallen in and clawed itself half to death getting out. "It came to drink," he said. "My water should not be a trap." He'd nearly drained his own dry season supply, rebuilding the bank so the next thirsty thing wouldn't drown in his kindness. A man the valley believed would cut your throat for sport, redesigning his well so a wild pig wouldn't be afraid of it. I saw him with the dog. There was a half-wild yellow cur that had been hanging around the wash, somebody's cast-off, ribs like a washboard, and it would not come near me. But it lay at the edge of his fire of an evening with its chin on its paws, and he never once made a fuss over it and never once chased it off. And there was always, I noticed, a little more meat scorched at the edge of the coals than one man would eat. He'd push the burnt piece off to the side with a stick when he thought I wasn't watching. The dog had a name in his tongue, too. He wouldn't tell me that one either. Some things were his. And I saw him grieve once by accident. I'd come up late, near dark, and found him not at the cave but on the high bench above it, at a place I hadn't known was there, a ring of stones, and inside the ring 3 low mounds, old, sunk, grown over with the tough little flowers that come up after rain. He was sitting beside them. He didn't hear me, or he let me think he didn't. And I understood, the way you understand a thing in your body before your mind catches up, that this was his cottonwood bench, his 2 stones. Except there were 3 mounds, not 2, and one of them was very small, and I have a small stone of my own under a cottonwood, and I knew without being told what a mound that size means. I backed away. I rode home without speaking to him. It was the only thing I had to give him that night, his privacy, and it was little enough against what I'd helped take. That was the night I understood the cave all the way down. He hadn't been put there. He'd come back to it, back to the ground his people had died on, back to the rock above the graves of his wife and his 2 children, because a man who has buried everything he loves does not move away and leave them. He stays, he who stays. He had built a swept and tidy life out of a tomb, because it was the last address his family had ever known, and from 11 miles off we had looked up at the smoke of his fire and decided it was the lair of a beast. I came down off that knowledge changed in a way the storm hadn't managed. The storm had shown me he was harmless. The graves showed me he was me, only braver and lonelier, and 1,000 times more wronged. It was Del Cobb who brought the other thing. I should have seen it coming. I'd been so taken up with the man in the cliff that I'd let myself forget the valley was a thing with its own slow weather, and a story that's been believed for years does not like a man who stops repeating it. I'd gone quiet on the cave, and quiet in a small place is loud. Folks had noticed Hartman taking his wagon up the lower wash. Folks had noticed Hartman buying more bacon than a man eating alone could get through. Folks talked. Folks always talk. The town gathered at the church on a Wednesday over a different matter, a question of damming the upper seep for stock water, the very seep that fed his garden, though I doubt 1 man in 10 knew or cared that it did, and the meeting curdled, the way they do, and by the end of it the real subject was the Apache and Koyukon wash. Del stood up. He'd had no beer, which was worse because it meant he meant it. He said the storm 2 weeks back had nearly washed out the lower road, and that everyone knew the wash was getting dangerous, and that with the bigger storms coming on, it was the front edge of the wet season. The old hands could smell it. No decent family was safe with a wild man sitting up at the head of all that water like a spider in a drain. He said his posy couldn't sleep for fear. He said the man had no right to the land, which was true and beside the point. He said it was past time the valley did something, and he said the word fortify, and he said, looking around the room and not quite at me, that some folks seemed to have gone soft on the question, and he wondered why. And I sat in the 3rd pew with my hat in my hands and my heart going like a trapped bird, and I did not stand up. I want to put that down plainly because it's the heavy thing, the thing I have to carry. There was a moment, there's always a moment, where the room hung waiting and a single honest voice would have turned it, or at least split it, and I had the voice and I knew the truth, and I had carried a man stones up out of a riverbed with my own hands. And I sat. I told myself it would do no good. I told myself Del was a bully and the meeting was lost already. I told myself I'd speak to the right men privately after, where it'd land better. Every word of it was the 11 days kind of true, true enough to hide behind. The plain fact is I was afraid to be the man who took the Apache's side in front of the whole valley, afraid of the silence that would fall, afraid of the long ride home into a country that had decided I was a stranger too. They didn't vote to kill him. I want to be fair. It was uglier and more cowardly than that, the way these things mostly are. They voted to dam the upper seep, to take his water, and to send a party of men up the wash to have a talk, and encourage him to move on along, with rifles, because you don't go up to talk to a wild man without rifles. And everyone in that church knew exactly what kind of talk a dozen armed men have with one old man over the only water that keeps his corn alive. They said it for Saturday. They were pleased with themselves. They felt safe. Posey Cobb would sleep. I rode home in the dark with the heavy thing sitting on my chest, and somewhere up the black wall of the western sky, the lightning was already walking the mountains. I didn't sleep. Past midnight I got up and stood on the porch and watched it come. The old hands had been right. You could feel it the way you feel a fever coming, a heaviness in the air, a stillness with a weight behind it, and away to the west the mountains lighting up from inside like a forge again and again. No sound yet, the thunder still too far off to carry. The first storm, the hail and the flood that had thrown me into his cave, had been the sky clearing its throat. This was the thing itself, gathering up there over the high country where all the canyons were born, loading itself with 3 weeks of held water, getting ready to pour the whole of it down through the only channel it knew. Down through Coyoacán Wash. I stood there and I did the arithmetic, because arithmetic is the one thing I can always do when my heart won't behave. The storm was a day off, maybe less. The men were going up Saturday, also a day off. And the wash, when that water came down off the mountains, would run 20 feet deep in places and carry boulders the size of wagons, and any man caught in the bottom of it would not be found until spring, in pieces, in the valley. I knew this because I'd seen what the small storm had done. I'd been a quarter step ahead of it myself. The men would go up the wash to drive him out, and the storm would come down the wash to drown them all, and the only high, dry, walled place in 11 miles of killing country was a hole in a cliff that I had spent 2 years calling a prison, and that a grieving old man had spent a lifetime turning into the strongest fortress in the territory. And not one soul in that valley but me knew it was anything but a beast's lair to be feared and avoided. I thought about Posey Cobb, who couldn't sleep for fear of him, who would be safe in town. I thought about her father Dell, who would not be. Dell would lead the party up himself. I had no doubt, rifle and righteousness both. I thought about the dozen men who'd raised their hands in the church, men I'd eaten beside, men who were wrong and cruel and frightened, and who did not for all that deserve to die screaming in the dark under 100 tons of water. And I thought about him, the stayer, who would be sitting at the mouth of his cave when they came, keeping the only watch he had, and who would have to decide, when the men who'd come to drive him from his children's graves were suddenly clinging to the rocks below him with the flood roaring up to take them, whether to open his fortress to them, or to let the country he'd been exiled to do the thing the country does. I couldn't make that choice for him, but I could ride. I could get up the wash ahead of both the storm and the Saturday men, and I could warn him, and God help me, I didn't even know what I'd do then. Stand beside him, try to turn Dell back. I only knew I could not sit a second meeting out. I'd done my sitting. It had cost me 11 days and a girl's honest question and my own good opinion of myself, and I would not pay it again. I saddled the gelding by lightning. He didn't give me his contempt this time. Horses know weather better than men know anything, and he stood quiet and grim while I cinched him, both of us looking west at the forge light on the mountains, and then I swung up and turned his head toward Coyoacán Wash and the gathering dark, and we rode out into the front edge of the worst night that country had seen in 40 years. I didn't know yet that I'd be too late to stop any of it. I only knew the rain had started, the first fat drops, warm as blood, striking the brim of my hat one at a time, like a slow hand counting down. They'd gone up early. Of course they had. I should have counted on it. The old hands could smell the storm same as I could, And a man like Del Cobb doesn't see a coming flood as a reason to wait. He sees it as a reason to hurry, to get his ugly business done and be back by his own fire before the sky breaks. So while I'd stood on my porch doing arithmetic with my heart, Del had been rousting his party in the black before dawn, and by the time the gelding carried me up into the mouth of Coyoacán Wash with the rain coming sideways, the Saturday men were already a half-mile ahead of me, strung out along the bottom of the canyon, climbing toward the cave with their rifles wrapped in oilcloth and their hat brims streaming. I knew it by their horses first. I came around the bend where the wash narrows below the seep, and there they stood, 8, 10. A dozen saddle horses tied in a bunch to the brush at the canyon bottom, hunched and miserable in the downpour. And beyond them up the slope I could see the men, dark shapes against the gray, fanned out below the cliff, and one of them with his arm up, pointing, shouting something the wind tore to rags before it reached me. And above them at the mouth of the cave a single still figure, watching. He hadn't run, he never would. I put my heels to the gelding and we went up the wash at a dead, dangerous gallop, splashing through water that hadn't been there an hour ago. The first of it, ankle-deep, brown, hurrying downhill faster than water has any right to, and I was screaming before I knew I'd opened my mouth. Del, get out of the bottom. Get up The wind ate it, or he ignored it. Del turned and saw me coming, and his face went from surprise to a kind of vicious satisfaction, because here at last was the soft man come to show his true colors. Here was Hartman throwing in with the savage, and he swung his oilcloth bundle off his shoulder and started unwrapping his rifle, and I understood that the fool thought I was the threat. That in the whole roaring world the dangerous thing, to Del Cobb's mind, was me and the old man, and not the wall of mountain water that was right then gathering itself in the dark canyons above us. I have replayed the next 90 seconds more times than there are nights in a year. I got to the foot of the slope. I came off the gelding before he'd stopped and grabbed the nearest man, a young one. The brute boy couldn't have been 17, gone up to be a man among men, and I shoved him bodily toward the cliff and yelled into his face that the flood was coming, the flood. And he looked at me with his mouth open and his rifle forgotten. And I think he was the only one who believed me, because the young can still believe in death when their elders have argued themselves out of it. The rest of them were a knot of shouting, Del hollering about trespass and savages, 2 others taking it up, somebody's rifle going off into the air by accident or on purpose, the report flat and small under the thunder. And then the sound came. If you have never heard it, you cannot be told. It is not a roar. A roar is a thing the throat makes, and the throat is alive, and a roar can be reasoned with. This was the sound of the world grinding, a deep, building, gut-low rumble that came up through the soles of your boots before it ever reached your ears, the sound of 10,000 tons of water and rock, an uprooted tree coming down a stone channel with nowhere else to go. And every horse in the wash went mad at once, screaming and tearing at their tethers, and every man stopped shouting, because the animal in us is older than the fool in us, and the animal knew. I looked up the canyon. A quarter-mile off, where the wash bent out of sight, the gray air had gone white, a churning white wall, head high and growing, throwing spray to the canyon rims, and it came around the bend like a living thing that had been let off a chain, and it was faster than a horse, faster than thought, and there was no time. There was simply no time at all. That is the moment the cave saved every life it saved. Because in that moment, with the flood a quarter-mile out and closing, a man's whole nature gets boiled down to one thing, what he does without deciding to. And the old man, the stayer, who had every cause under heaven to step back into his fortress and pull the hide across the door and let the country do to these men what these men had come to do to him. He came down. I saw him come down off his ledge and down the steep path he'd worn into the cliff over a lifetime of going to and from his children's graves, sure-footed where any of us would have fallen, and he hit the bottom of the slope among us shouting one word, the only word that mattered, and he had the strength of 40 years of survival behind it. UP. He grabbed Del, who had a rifle half raised at him. Del, who'd stood in a church and called him a spider in a drain. He grabbed Del by the back of his collar the exact way he'd grabbed mine in the first storm, and he threw him at the cliff path, threw a grown man uphill like a sack of seed, and turned for the next one. After that it was hands and noise and water rising to the knee. He was everywhere. He knew the cliff and we didn't, knew the one path up to the high ledge that the flood couldn't reach, and he stood at the foot of it like a gate, and he put men onto it one after another, shoving, hauling, gripping wrists, his face running with rain and gone utterly calm, the calm of a man doing the thing he was made for. The Prout boy, two of the Hanisi brothers. A fellow named Otis who'd lost his rifle and his nerve both and stood frozen until the old man slapped him hard across the face and pointed, and Otis went. I got my shoulder under a man whose leg had folded, Carl Webb, gone down on the slick rock, and between the old man and me, we walked him up the path with the water clawing at our heels. We made the high ledge, all of us, soaked and gasping and small, and we turned in time to see the white wall arrive. It hit the bottom of the wash where we'd been standing not a minute before, and it did not slow down. The brush where the horses had been tied, the horses, God, the horses, I won't tell you about the horses, was simply gone, erased. The whole canyon floor become a single brown torrent 20 feet deep and climbing, throwing whole trees end over end like a child's jackstraws. And the noise of it filled up the world so completely that we couldn't hear ourselves and so stopped trying. And we stood pressed against the cliff on a ledge a body's length above the flood, 12 men and an old Apache, watching the country we'd taken from him try to take us in turn. And the cave behind us, the prison, the lair, the spider's drain held the storm off our backs, dry and dark and waiting, exactly as it had held the storm off mine. We'd have all lived. I need you to understand that because of what came after. We were up. We were safe. The water could rise another 10 feet and not reach us. The old man had done it, had thrown his enemies up onto the one rock in 11 miles that could keep them, and we were all of us going to walk home, even Del. That's when I heard the dog. It was barking somewhere below, frantic, and I looked and couldn't place it. And then the old man went rigid beside me. The only time all that morning I saw fear move through him, and he was looking down at the flood, and I followed his eyes, and I saw it too. A wagon, half a wagon, the box of it tumbling in the current, Del's wagon, the one the party had hauled up with their gear, broken loose and rolling in the flood. And clinging to the boards of it, white-faced, soundless, her little hands locked in a grip that a flood would have to break finger by finger, was Posey Cobb. She'd stowed away. I learned it after, that she'd been so frightened her father would be hurt by the wild man, so wound up by every story Del had ever told her to make her behave, that in the dark before dawn she'd crept into the wagon bed and hidden under the canvas to be near him, 8 years old and full of a terror her own father had built and handed her. She'd come up the wash to save her daddy from the monster. And now the country had her, and the monster was the only thing fast enough to do anything about it. Del came apart. I have seen grown men break, and it is a terrible thing, and I will not describe it. He went for the edge, and 3 of us hauled him back because he'd have gone straight into the flood and added himself to it. And the water had the wagon now and was carrying it down and away, and the child on it, and there was nothing. The old man was already moving. He'd seen the one chance, and he took it without a word to any of us, because words cost time and there wasn't any. Below our ledge downstream, a dead cottonwood had jammed crossways in the flood, its roots hooked into the canyon wall, its trunk slanting out over the water like an arm, and the wreck of the wagon was being carried straight toward it. He went down the cliff. Down the wet, sheer, killing rock, faster than a man should be able and not once slipping, and he got out onto that jammed trunk over the heart of the flood with the spray bursting up around him, and he wedged his bare feet into the roots, and he leaned out over 20 feet of churning death with both scarred arms open, and he waited for the river to bring him the child. It brought her fast. The wagon struck the trunk and shattered, and Posey came off it and into the water, and he had her. He had her. One hand fisted in the back of her dress, his whole body wrenched sideways by the pull of her small weight in that current. And for one heartbeat, one single heartbeat, I let myself believe it. Then the cottonwood let go. The roots tore out of the bank. The whole tree shifted and dropped its butt end into the flood, and the old man went down to one knee on the trunk with the child clutched to his chest, and he did the last thing I ever saw him do as a free choice. He twisted, and with everything left in him he threw her, threw Posey Cobb up and across the narrowing gap toward the snag below us, where two of the Hennessy brothers were already flat on their bellies with their arms out. And she struck their hands, and they had her. They had her. They dragged her up, small and broken-looking, but alive, alive, screaming now, which is the most beautiful sound a child can make. And the tree, freed of its anchor and freed of her weight, swung out into the main channel and took the old man with it. I saw his face for less than a second as the current spun the trunk around. I have spent a great deal of effort trying to remember it as peaceful, and I won't lie to you and say that it was. It wasn't anything. It was a man's face, wet and tired, going away on brown water faster than I could draw breath to shout his name. The name I'd never been able to say, the only one that was his. And then the wash bent and the flood carried him around it and out of the world, and the last of him I ever saw was the white scar on his jaw catching the gray light, once, before the spray closed over it. He'd stayed his whole life, he who stays. He had buried a wife and 2 children and refused for a lifetime to leave the rock above their graves, had let a valley call him a beast rather than move so much as 11 miles from his dead. And the one time, the only time in all those years that I ever saw him reach out past the edge of his own grief for another living soul, the country took him for it. Took him down the same wash that drowned all the rest of his people, and gave him in exchange the life of the daughter of the man who'd come to drive him off. I don't know what to do with that. I want you to know I still don't. I've turned it in my hands like he turned his stones, looking for the place it wants to sit, and 20 years on it still won't sit. Some things don't. We came down off the cliff at dusk when the flood had spent itself. The wash ran low and brown and innocent, the way a thing looks innocent after it's killed, and we walked out of it carrying Posey and Carl Webb's broken leg and our own sick silence, and not one man among us could meet another's eye. We found his garden swept to bare stone, the 3 little terraces he'd built up rock by rock, the corn and the beans and the squash that grew up through each other, gone, every trace, scoured down to the ledge as if it had never been. We found the high bench and the ring of stones and the 3 mounds untouched, above the flood line where he'd known to keep them. We never found him. We looked that week, and after, even Dell looked, Dell most of all. Dell, who never said one word to me again that wasn't quiet, Dell, who pulled down the half-built dam at the seep with his own hands and his own crew and never told anyone why. We searched the wash all the way to the valley and into the spring. The country kept him. It keeps its own. The yellow cur came back to the cave 3 days after and lay down at the cold mouth of it and would not be coaxed off. I left food. It ate when I'd gone. For a long while I half believed that if I came up the wash quiet enough at the right gray hour I'd find a small fire banked against the back wall and an iron-gray head turned to the dark, keeping watch, the only door he had. I never did. But I kept the food up there anyway, and I keep it still. And I have stopped being able to tell you whether I do it for the dog or for myself, or for the chance, the foolish chance, that staying runs deeper in some men than even a flood can reach. I went into town that next Sunday and I climbed up on the steps of the church where Dell had stood, and this time I did not sit. I told them all of it, the shoulder he set, the corn he grew, the javelina he saved, the meat he left out for a half-wild dog, the 3 graves on the bench, the name that meant he who stays. I told them what he did at the foot of the cliff and what he did out on the cottonwood, and I told them that the hole in the rock they'd all called a prison their whole lives was the only thing in 11 miles that hadn't drowned their husbands and their sons, and that the man they'd built into a monster had died throwing their freighter's little girl back up out of the water with the last strength in his body. I didn't spare myself. I told them I'd sat in that same room and held my tongue when one true word might have stopped the whole of it. I told them I'd taught their children to be afraid of him, in this very building, with my own coward's mouth. I don't know that it changed them. People are slow, and a story believed for 20 years does not let go in one Sunday. But Posey Cobb grew up and she remembered. She is a grown woman now with children of her own, and she has told them the true story so many times that out here, among the young ones at least, the wash has a different name than it used to, and the cave is not a place to be afraid of, and the man who lived in it is not a wild thing in the dark. They call him the Stayer. They got it from me, and I got it from him, and he got it from a mother whose people are mostly gone now too. I think he would have hated to be made into a story again, after what stories did to him. But it is the only door I have left to him, the telling, and I have learned from a better man than myself that you do not abandon the thing you love just because all you can do for it now is keep watch. I am old. I will not go up the wash many more times. The dog is long dead, and there is a small flat stone up there now that I set myself. Beside the 3, he never let me see him grieve at, and when I go I take off my hat and I do not put it back on for a long time. There's no marker on it. I never could spell his name.